he started getting a lot of ear infections and sinus infections and sore throats. So when he was 2.5, we had his tonsils out, and the x-rays picked up an abnormality in the bone. So they took x-rays of his entire body, and they found that there was something wrong. They weren't sure what.
Most people think they know this story. A boy born with a face the world wasn't ready for, a mother who refused to apologize for who she was, and a Hollywood movie that made millions of people cry in dark theaters. But here's the thing about stories that get turned into movies. The parts that don't fit the narrative get quietly trimmed away, smoothed over, or simply dropped on the cutting room floor. And what got left behind in Rocky Dennis's real story? That's the part Rusty Dennis spent years trying to tell anyone who would actually listen. Before she died in 2006, she said things about her son, about that film, and about the night Rocky took his last breath that most people never heard. And once you hear them, the movie you thought you knew looks completely different. Let's go back to the beginning, because the foundation of this story matters more than most people realize. Roy Lee Dennis was born on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California. His mother, Florence, everybody called her Rusty, was a Brooklyn-born woman with sharp edges and a sharper tongue. His father was Roy Dennis, her second husband. As a baby, Rocky wouldn't sleep unless someone rocked him constantly, and that's where the nickname came from. For the first couple of years of his life, he was just a kid, a sickly one, with frequent ear and sinus infections, but nothing that set off any serious alarm bells. Then, around age 2, he went in for a routine tonsillectomy, and an X-ray technician noticed something in the skull that didn't look right. What followed was close to a full year of appointments at UCLA Medical Center, multiple visits every single week, as doctors tried to put a name to what they were seeing. The name they finally landed on was craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. It is one of the rarest conditions in documented medical history. When Rusty first received that diagnosis in 1965, doctors told her that only 6 other cases had ever been recorded anywhere in the world. 6. The condition causes abnormal calcium deposits to build up inside the skull. The bones thicken and push outward, slowly distorting the face, compressing the brain, and destroying vision, hearing, and neurological function over time. The doctors who sat across from Rusty Dennis delivered the prognosis without much softening. Her son would lose his sight. He would likely experience severe cognitive decline, and he would be dead before his 7th birthday. Rusty Dennis heard all of that and made a decision. She was not going to let those words define her son's life. Now here is where you have to understand who Rusty actually was, because the version Cher played on screen, as brilliant as that performance was still a cleaned-up, cinema-ready version of a far more complicated human being. Rusty was born in Brooklyn on May 29, 1936. Her father drove trucks. She was Jewish, street-raised, and apparently decided very early that conventional living was not going to be her path. By 13, she had been kicked out of junior high for not showing up. By 14, she was running with motorcycle gangs and had discovered marijuana. At 15, she dropped out of school entirely and took a job as a dancer at Coney Island, the kind of act they called a hoochie coochie show. She was not yet old enough to legally drive a car. At 17, she married a truck driver named Thomas Mason. Their son Joshua was born shortly after. That marriage ended, and she eventually made her way to California, married Roy Dennis, and in 1961, Rocky arrived. By the time Rocky was diagnosed, Rusty had already built her entire worldview around one central belief, that the human mind has the power to create illness, and therefore has the power to undo it. She had decided this for herself years earlier, and she raised Rocky entirely inside that philosophy. When he had headaches, when the pain got bad, she would send him to his room and tell him to will himself well. In her mind, she was giving him power over his own body rather than letting him see himself as a helpless victim of his condition. Whether you read that as empowering or complicated probably says something about you, because it was genuinely both. The biker world that surrounded Rocky wasn't just background color. The Tykes, the motorcycle club Rusty ran with, were his extended family. Sam Elliott's character in the film, Gar, was based on a real man named Bernie Tullis, Rusty's longtime partner. These were hard-living people, but by every account, they loved Rocky without reservation and without the discomfort that so many strangers couldn't hide when they looked at his face. They were rougher and more loyal than anything a Hollywood script could quite capture. and Rusty's drug use. The film framed it as the behavior of a woman drowning, someone overwhelmed by grief and impossible circumstances reaching for something to dull the pain. Rusty rejected that framing completely. In interviews, she said plainly that she partied all the time and that drugs were simply part of that lifestyle. She wasn't reaching for a crutch. She was living the way she wanted to live, and she owned it entirely. Meanwhile, Rocky Dennis was doing something that should have been medically impossible. He was living. Doctors had given him until age 7. Rocky blew past 7 and kept going. He graduated Sandberg Junior High as an honor student despite starting behind academically. His classmates elected him best buddy, most good-natured, and friendliest camper. He charged $3 an hour to tutor other students, and he negotiated that rate himself. He memorized the night sky. He fell in love at summer camp with a girl who was blind, a girl who could not see the face that made strangers look away, and by every account it was real and tender in everything that word is supposed to mean. When doctors once proposed surgery that might alter his features, Rocky asked a question that has stayed with people for decades. He asked who he would see in the mirror if he changed his face. And then he chose to keep it exactly as it was. His mother pushed for all of it. She fought school administrators who tried to redirect Rocky into special education, arguing that their hesitation was about the discomfort of other parents rather than any limitation in Rocky himself. She confronted doctors who tried to give him timelines and ceilings. She refused, consistently and loudly, to let anyone hand her son a smaller life than he deserved. Screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan, who wrote the Mask screenplay after meeting Rocky at UCLA's Center for Genetic Research, put it plainly. She said Rusty was not a conventional mother, but she was exactly the mother Rocky needed. Phelan had gone to meet Rocky expecting to find someone defined by his condition, and instead found warmth, humor, and a kid who was entirely himself. By 1985, Mask was in theaters and making serious money. The film grossed over $48 million at the box office. The amount Rusty Dennis was paid for the rights to her life, and her son's story was $15,000. That number deserves a moment of quiet attention. $48 million in ticket sales. $15,000 to the woman without whom none of it exists. But the story behind those $15,000 is even harder to sit within the number itself. At the time the film was released, Rusty's oldest son Joshua, the one the movie erased entirely, the brother who never appears on screen, had been diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, a cancer closely associated with AIDS during the devastating epidemic of the 1980s. Joshua was gay, he was sick, and he needed care. According to available records surrounding the film, most of that $15,000 went toward Joshua's medical bills. Rusty Dennis did not sell her dead son's story for profit or recognition. She sold it to try to keep her living son alive. Joshua died in 1987 at the age of 32. Rusty had now buried both of her sons. When reporters came to Rusty after the film's release, they came expecting a grateful mother, maybe tearful, maybe overwhelmed by the tribute Hollywood had paid to her boy. What they got was something considerably more interesting. She called the movie a fairy tale. Not a love letter, not a memorial, not a beautiful tribute, a fairy tale. Those were her exact words. In a 1986 profile published by the Chicago Tribune, she said she had always believed that showing Rocky's courage could help disabled children and the parents of disabled children, and that sometimes parents are more disabled than their kids. But she said she hadn't anticipated the film becoming so much about her as well. She acknowledged, generously, that Cher's performance had turned her into something like a heroine, and she wasn't entirely comfortable with that framing. On Cher herself, Rusty was surprisingly warm. She told the Tribune that Cher depicted her very accurately, and then she added a line that explains everything about who Rusty Dennis was. She said she had always considered herself perfectly normal, and that the rest of the world was the one that was nuts. She did identify two significant places where the film departed from reality. The first was compression. The movie collapsed more than a decade of lived experience into what felt like roughly a year. The second was Joshua. His complete absence from Rocky's story on screen bothered her. He wasn't a footnote in their lives. He was Rocky's brother. Cutting him out meant cutting out a whole dimension of who Rocky actually was and where he came from. And then there was the music. Rocky Dennis loved Bruce Springsteen deeply and genuinely. Director Peter Bogdanovich had constructed the film's entire emotional architecture around Springsteen's songs. But Universal Pictures could not finalize a deal with Columbia Records, and without informing Bogdanovic, they replaced the Springsteen soundtrack with Bob Seger tracks. Rusty's response to this, in a 1985 appearance on a San Francisco talk show, was brief and precise. She said she didn't think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was. 7 words. She didn't need any more than that. Bogdanovic was furious enough to sue Universal for $19 million over the unauthorized change. The Springsteen songs were eventually restored for the 2004 director's cut DVD release, 2 full decades after the film first opened. By September of 1978, Rocky was 16 years old, and the disease that had chased him his entire life was finally closing the distance. He was using a wheelchair in his final weeks. The headaches that had been his companion since early childhood had escalated beyond anything that could be managed. On the evening of October 2nd, the family went to dinner together, Rocky, Rusty, and the people who had always formed the outer ring of their unconventional household. Everyone that could see how much ground he had lost. When they came home that night, Rocky had a headache. Rusty did what she had done his entire life. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. It was not cruelty and it was not negligence. It was the same thing she had told him 1,000 times before, the same philosophy she had raised him inside of, the belief that had given him a sense of agency over a body that was working against him every single day. He went to sleep. He never woke up. Rocky Dennis died on the morning of October 3rd, 1978, at home, peacefully, in his bed. He was 16 years old and a few weeks away from 17. He had outlived his original death sentence by nearly a full decade. The movie shows Rusty discovering his body herself, a scene that is raw and genuinely affecting. In reality, she was not home when it happened. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug possession charge. Her partner Bernie was the one who called to tell her. That detail is not a condemnation of Rusty as a mother, but it is exactly the kind of truth that Hollywood couldn't quite hold onto, because it doesn't resolve cleanly into anything. It just sits there, complicated and real. Rusty never framed the make yourself well philosophy as something she regretted. She never apologized for it publicly or described it as a failure. What she said, consistently and without qualification, was that she believed in it completely and that it had given Rocky something most people never find, the genuine refusal to see himself as someone who was dying. After Rocky was gone, and then after Joshua was gone, Rusty rebuilt herself again, which was apparently something she was always capable of doing. She moved to San Francisco. She took up Buddhism. She worked as a counselor for people struggling with drug addiction. She had plans to work with the Shanti Project, an organization supporting people living with terminal illness including AIDS patients. The woman who had spent decades defined by chaos was, by the mid-1980s, doing quiet and serious work. She still rode motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, Rusty, by then going by Florence Tullis, was riding her 3-wheeled motorcycle when the right tire came off. She lost control, hit a curb, and her body struck a telephone pole. What happened next was in some ways worse than the accident itself. Nobody knew. Friends and family had no information until a small item appeared in the San Gabriel Valley Tribune mentioning an unidentified 70-year-old woman hurt in a motorcycle accident. They made the connection and went to find her. She had 2 broken legs and a punctured lung. She survived the impact. She was Rusty Dennis. So of course she did. But the infection that followed was the thing her body could not beat back. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70 years old. A 1986 Chicago Tribune profile described her as a 49-year-old Jewish mother, former drug addict, go-go dancer, and Shockley products distributor, living in a tidy biker household in San Francisco's Mission District with 1 nephew and 3 bikers named Pelican, Lenny, and Steve. That description is simultaneously absurd and completely precise, and it explains Rusty Dennis better than most eulogies could. So what does all of this actually mean when you step back from it? Rocky Dennis spent 16 years, nearly 17, proving that a prognosis is not the destiny. He did it through warmth and humor and a stubborn, complete refusal to let how he looked become the most important thing about him. He tutored other kids, loved music, memorized constellations, fell in love, graduated with honors, and looked the world in the eye every single day. When he had the chance to change his face, he chose his own. His mother was a Brooklyn-raised biker with a complicated personal history, a philosophy about illness and healing that she never once walked back, and a love for her son that expressed itself in ways that didn't always look like love from the outside, but clearly felt like it from the inside. She fought for him in every room where people tried to make his life smaller. She surrounded him with people who saw him fully. She told him he was not a victim, and he believed her. She sold his story for $15,000, and she spent most of it trying to save her other son. Before she died, she said Rocky's death was just another place to go, and that he had always loved going places. She said she and Joshua simply did not believe in dying. She never once asked why this had all happened to her family. Not for Rocky, not for Joshua, and not for herself. The screenwriter who brought their story to the screen said Rusty was not the PTA Mother of the Year, but that she was the perfect mother for Rocky. Whether that reads as a compliment or something more led is a question worth sitting with. What the record shows, without any editorial softening, is that Rocky Dennis died at home, in his sleep, without machines or hospital rooms or clinical indignity. His mother had made him a promise about that, and she kept it. Rusty Dennis died in November 2006, 70 years old, on a motorcycle, still moving, still entirely herself, unable to stop being who she had always been right up until the end. If you came here looking for a neat redemption story with clean edges and a lesson that wraps up in a single sentence, Rusty Dennis was never going to be the person who gave you that. What she gave you instead was harder and more honest, the actual truth, with all its contradictions left in, exactly as messy and real as a life lived fully on your own terms always is.